Okay, so we were just discussing about how parents, teachers, peers, and extracurricular activities can impact a student's success. And so now we're going to switch gears to culture, and then we're going to talk about learning disabilities. And that's going to be kind of where we end, and then finally gifted students. And then this is going to finish out this chapter. Um, so, when we look at socioeconomic status and ethnicities, we know that from a lot of research, critics will, argue that schools haven't really done a really good job of educating low income. So, if we look at low income students, those who are coming from ethnic minority backgrounds, um, looking at those particular students, as well as emerging adults, to overcome several of the barriers that they have to their achievement. And so, if you look at the education of students coming from low income backgrounds, what you find is that many adolescents in poverty face problems that present barriers to their learning. And so, if you look at schools compared to schools in higher income areas compared to those in low income areas, what you're going to find is that um, those lower income areas school systems are going to have more likely to have students with lower achievement scores. They're going to have lower graduation rates. They're going to have smaller percentages of students who go off to college. They're going to more likely to have younger teachers with less experience, not a non-credentialed teachers, not teachers who are less qualified. You might find that they actually have more substitute teachers who are regularly filling in. Um, you're going to see things like the schools encouraging rote learning, and you're going to see that they're not going to provide as much adequate support for English language learners. And so, living in these economically disadvantaged families during adolescence is going to relate to more negative achievement outcomes than do corresponding circumstances in childhood. So this is a really important factor to consider, that there are some um, uh, there are some really important factors that can contribute to these barriers to learning, and then result in emerging adults who are not prepared to go into the next step, and then also aren't able to financially be able to do things like go to college. They're not going to be able to sort of be socialized to do that. They don't really find that it's an option. And you may even find that, especially if you're from, some more rural areas that have lower income, you might find that people, or you yourself might have been one of those situations where you weren't encouraged to go to college because your family couldn't afford it, or you just weren't given a lot of support in school for that. So you might actually have experienced this yourself. Um, Now, there are some really, really innovative solutions to this. So, there are some really innovative programs that indicate that improving certain characteristics of schools can actually enhance achievement of adolescents from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. So, things like, very important here, I'm going to write smaller class size. Really important, getting more one on one with teachers. This is really difficult, though, especially if you have a school system with less staff. That's going to be really harder to do because we're already fighting this system, right? But if you can get a program where you have smaller class size, longer classes, being able to engage with students for more time, creating advisory sessions, allotting times for teachers to explore teaching methods. These are all linked to higher levels of achievement in high school. So we really want to try to intervene with these schools and get some of these innovative solutions in there, so that we can increase the success of these students. Um, we also find that in differences in ethnicity in school. So, for example, 1/3 of Black students, almost 1/3 of Latina students attend schools in the 47 largest city school districts in the U.S. And many of these inner school systems are still segregated. They're grossly underfunded, and they do not provide adequate opportunities for children to learn effectively. And even outside inner city schools, we still see segregation in the U.S. education system. And we find that the school experience of students from different ethnic groups, they really vary quite considerably. And it's arguable, but I would agree that U.S. school systems are doing an especially poor job of meeting the needs of America's fastest growing minority population, which is Latinos. And if we look at some of these poorer school systems that aren't able to have the support for students who are coming in, especially those who are second English language learners, and not giving the support for that, that is a serious issue. We see that the high school graduation rate for Latinas lags behind that for any other ethnic minority group except for Native Americans. And so doing things that in your classroom that can allow for improving these relationships across ethnically diverse students, especially if you have a wide variety of students with lots of different backgrounds. One thing that's really, really interesting is something called a jigsaw classroom. So a jigsaw classroom is where students from different cultural backgrounds are placed in cooperative groups. They have to construct something from different parts of a project to reach a common goal. So everybody has a piece of the puzzle. So everybody's kind of equal on the same playing field. Nobody has an advantage. Everybody needs to have that thing, and everybody needs to do their part in order to make that sort of project complete. Doing things like encouraging students to have positive personal contacts with diverse other students, right? Encouraging students to engage in perspective taking. This is a really important one. And making sure that students have access to lots of different kinds of backgrounds. Help students think critically, be more emotionally intelligent about cultural issues. Sometimes these are hard conversations to have, but you have to have a warm classroom, a safe environment for students to feel comfortable to have those discussions. Also doing things like reduce bias, understanding what implicit bias is, understanding that, we all have some bias and that we just need to be aware of that, and that's the first step to help combat it. If you view the school and the community as a team, then that is going to help the student feel like they're part of more of like a system or a family. Also, as a teacher, to be a competent cultural mediator, understanding the differences and being able to facilitate and mediate discussion on that. That's done so in a really safe and non-threatening way. Multicultural education is actually really important, and this is education that values diversity, includes perspective of a variety of different cultural groups without thinking about an ethnocentric sort of view. So thinking that one particular ethnicity or culture is the best or the default, for example. And so proponents of multicultural education believe that children and youth of color should be empowered, and that multicultural education benefits all students regardless of your ethnicity. And an important goal is equal educational opportunity for all students regardless of ethnicity. This really grew out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and the call for equality and social justice for women and people of color. And so this is something that's not new. There's also, looking at something like critical race theory, and saying, and if you sort of blanket it all together and say, well, this is just, all the same thing, and it's just about making, for example, white people feel bad about, slavery that was done, generations ago. That's not what critical race theory is about. It's a perspective. It's a lens to view the history, and it's a way for us to understand how barriers have been set up culturally, whether intentional or not, that create barriers for people of color to be able to continue on and go through education and find jobs and succeed in life. And so again, it's just a very important thing to know what it is that we're studying in these schools, and what, and so it's very easy to kind of get caught up in this sort of debate, and very easy to get caught up in, what is the underlying purpose of this, what is the underlying cause? Well, that is to educate people on, all sides of history, and that's an important factor when we consider educating our adolescents. Now, If we look at cross-cultural comparisons, right? So when we look at um, different kinds of countries and how they are able to fulfill, their obligation for education. Um, of course, we see a lot of differences here. So we see that secondary schools, for example, in different countries share a lot of similar features, but they'll differ on others. So most countries will mandate that children begin school at about 6 to 7 years old. And they want them to stay in school until they're about 14 to 17, just depending on the country and depending on the school system. Most secondary schools around the world are divided into 2 or more levels. For example, a middle school, junior high, or junior high in a high school. So we do see a lot of separation there in secondary schools. In the US and Australia, these are among the few countries in the world in which sports are very, very important and an integral part of this public school system. Different schools vary in curriculum. So, for example, Brazil, students are required to take Portuguese and 4 foreign languages. We see in the U.S. a lot of times, as you get to high school, you're really required to take, one other language, and that isn't always a requirement depending on where you go. But in a lot of countries, they expect their students to be bilingual, or even multilingual, by the time they get into college or get out of school. We also see that college is very different across different countries. So Russia, surprisingly, has the largest percentage of 18 to 21-year-olds enrolled in college, and they have about 53.5% of 18 to 21-year-olds enrolled in college. And so we know that graduation rates, college attendance, all of those things vary based on country, and across even our own country, across the United States. So let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about disabilities, and then we're going to talk about gifted students. So we're just going to kind of finish this chapter up about school systems. So for a really long time, public schools really did not do a whole lot to educate adolescents with disabilities. And in the last several decades, federal legislation has mandated that all children and adolescents with disabilities receive a free and appropriate education. And so what we're finding is that these students are increasingly being educated in the regular classroom as opposed to, for example, a special education classroom. And there has been a significant increase in the percentage of children and youth 3 to 21 years of age in the U.S. who receive special education or related service. So if we say, 3 to 21 years old, that's kind of we've seen a big increase in that. And of the children in the U.S., about 13% of this age group right here, about 13%, receive special education or related services, and this statistic comes from like 2011, 2012, so it's increased since then. And so this right here is an increase of 3% when you compare it to 1980 to 1981. So we're seeing, a steady increase in children who are being able to receive services. And in fact, students with a learning disability were by far the largest group of students with a disability to be given special education. So really, when we consider what kinds of disabilities and services are available, we can see, like, for example, here about 4.7%, have a learning disability specifically. And we're going to talk just a little bit about some learning disabilities here in a minute. The next highest is speech and language impairments, which is about 2.8%, and then intellectual disability, autism, and emotional disturbance. So let's talk a little bit about learning disabilities because it constitutes such a high percentage of students who are receiving services compared to other kinds of disabilities. Now, adolescents with learning disabilities have difficulty in learning, and it involves understanding, could involve spoken or written language. It's anything in that category. So learning disabilities, this is a big umbrella term that covers a lot of different kinds of disabilities. So we could see a person having issues in listening, in thinking, reading, writing, spelling, any of these areas. We also see it involved in mathematics. So you can have no issues with reading, but you might have issues with being able to read formulas, being able to read numbers, for example. If you look from the mid 1970s through to the mid 90s, there was a really big dramatic increase in the percentage of U.S. students receiving special education services for a learning disability. And so, what some experts say is that the dramatic increase reflected poor diagnostic practices and over identification. And so, teachers were sometimes really quick, potentially too quick, to label children with even just the slightest learning problem as having a learning disability. So there's like an increase in knowledge about learning disability, and so then everybody was like, well, oh, that person is struggling, they must have a learning disability. So there's probably a lot of over-identification, services that were provided that potentially might have been not necessarily for a learning disability, but might have had something else going on that that they receive services for, that they should have received for services for something else. Some really interesting trends that we see that about 3 times as many boys as girls are classified as having a learning disability. And so there's some explanations for this gender difference, but it could also be a referral bias, because if, a student's having an issue related to attention, for example, it might be something else, but because the child is a boy and being disruptive or not being able to follow, that might be more of the reason why they were being referred. So it's unsure if there is a biological vulnerability among boys, or if it's a bias in reporting. We find that about 80%, this is a pretty large number, about 80% of students with a learning disability have a reading problem. And so, again, that would be, for example, dyslexia. Dysgraphia would be writing. Dyscalculia is math. There are terms for every kind of learning disability. Now, one thing that as researchers we try to do is use different techniques to try to understand what parts of the brain might be involved with learning disabilities. And so if we can learn about different kinds of brain areas through the use of, for example, MRI or fMRI, then maybe we can design interventions that can focus on strengthening those parts of the brain, or at least strengthening, like in the case of dyslexia, reading ability. So this would be an MRI, and this is a cage on this person's head, and this child is actually looking at this right here. This is a mirror, okay, and this is reflecting the image that's behind the child. So they are actually able to look at the mirror and see this. There's just like a screen behind them. They're able to see this because they're in this cage and there's not a lot of room here. So they're looking up to this and they're seeing this. Here they have a thing where they can actually click buttons. And so this whole thing spins internally. It's an MRI, it's a magnet, and it spins internally. And what it's doing is it's actually aligning the atoms in the brain, and it's able to look at, for example, in the case of fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging, it's looking at the blood flow, and it's looking at how what areas of the brain that the person is using given whatever task they're doing. So this person's looking at this thing. Maybe they say, okay, every time you see this, press this button. Anytime you see that, press this button. And it's giving us an idea of what's going on in the brain. In this case, for example, dyslexia, you might be given something to read, and anytime you see this letter, press this button. Anytime you see this letter, press that button, and the task can get more complex for the person to do. So this is an example of a particular task in using MRI. You can also use other techniques like EEG, electroencephalography, which looks at brain waves. Again, can give you some information about what the brain is doing in a time-based task. So let's look at another highly well-known, I should say, well-known condition called ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So this is a disability in which a child or adolescent is consistently showing one or more of particular characteristics might be inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and this occurs over a period of time. So, you might not have the hyperactivity component, then you would more likely to be diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. The number of children and adolescents diagnosed and treated for ADHD has increased substantially, and in some estimates actually doubling since the 1990s. And so we find that the disorder occurs as much as 4 to 9 times as much in boys than in girls. And so some experts actually attribute this increase mainly to just heightened awareness. So it might not be that more kids have ADHD, but now we're just much better at diagnosing it. And we also find that critics of that who say, oh no, it's not heightened awareness. We have so many diagnosed because they're incorrectly diagnosed. So a lot of times doctors are very quick to say, oh, there's this slight issue, they must have ADHD, without being really careful about diagnosis. So we don't know the causes of ADHD. We have some suspects. There have been some proposed causes. They've said maybe it's genetics, right? So it could be genetics. It could be a predisposition. So if you have a family member who has it, maybe you're predisposed to developing it. We've also found some proposed brain damage during a prenatal or postnatal development, so right in the womb or right after they've come out of the womb. We've also found some really interesting links with cigarette and alcohol exposure, and as well as high levels of maternal stress during pregnancy and low birth weight. So there have been some really interesting studies that have found a pretty strong link with a mother smoking while pregnant and having a much higher relationship to ADHD, also as well as drinking during pregnancy. And it's hard to tease apart what's going on, because if you have a person who is drinking and or smoking during pregnancy, chances are that child is going to have low birth weight. And so that is all sort of tied in together, and then that's also tied in with the likelihood of being diagnosed with ADHD. When we are able to do brain imaging, so for example, this picture here where the person's in an MRI machine, or EEG, no matter what we're doing, these are kinds of things that can help us better understand what's going on in the brain when a person has ADHD. We know that those children who have ADHD tend to struggle in school. There's, some increased academic and social demands of formal schooling, stricter standards of behavior, and that often sheds light on the fact that a child has ADHD and needs diagnosis. What we find is that about 70% of adolescents and then 65% of adults who were diagnosed as children continue to have issues and symptoms of ADHD as they continue on. Now, there's several treatments of ADHD. Many of you are probably familiar with stimulant medication like Ritalin or Adderall that can help improve attention, but a lot of kids don't like to take it because it feels very much like you're either ultra focused or you feel like a zombie. It doesn't often improve their attention to the same level as a person who doesn't have ADHD. There's been a lot of work on behavior management treatments, which are really effective in reducing the effects of ADHD, except that, that's something that takes time, right? That's something that you have to really commit to, that you have to do over a course of time. And a lot of times parents or teachers might push medication because it feels like a quicker fix, but the behavioral management treatments are really effective when you stick to them, and they're done really well. Now, critics argue that many physicians are too quick to prescribe stimulants for children who might have just a mild form of ADHD. Some really interesting sort of out-of-the-box treatments are things like neurofeedback. So researchers have been exploring the possibility of using neurofeedback to improve attention. So neurofeedback is, for example, you can see what your brain is doing while you're doing it. So you can kind of look at your brain waves as you are attending to something, and then you can actually control what waves, like what brain, if you're in beta waves or alpha waves, what the hertz level of your brain is doing with neurofeedback, because you're getting feedback from the activity that you're doing and the brain information. And that can actually help improve attention. Again, that's something that you have to work at, and that's something that you have to be trained to do. Mindfulness is also becoming more common. Mindfulness training and relaxing and understanding that you need to focus and understanding what your body and brain needs to focus. And then finally, exercise. This is also being investigated as a potential treatment for ADHD, and very helpful to understanding those changes. Now, if we look here at the brain, and this is sort of like just, kind of a drawing of the brain, what we find is that those children who have ADHD, we find that there's a bit of a delay in looking at the development of the prefrontal cortex. So here you can see that, and this is a much more prominent area. This is important for things like decision making. It's important for attention. It's important for logic. And we see a delay in the prefrontal cortex, greater than 2-year delay in those children who have ADHD. So we're seeing this taking them longer to mature compared to children who do not have ADHD. And then here you can see, so this is taking more than 2 years compared to typical children. And then here you see in the blue, this is a 0 to 2 year delay. So we're seeing some really interesting cases where the brain is taking longer to mature compared to those who do not have attention issues. So until the 1970s, most U.S. public schools either refused enrollment to children with disabilities or just didn't adequately serve them. And then thankfully in 1975, we had a law that came out that was requiring all students with disabilities to be given a free and appropriate public education. And then in 1990, we found that there was another sort of recast that spelled out broad mandates for services to children with disabilities of all kinds. And this includes things like evaluation, eligibility determination, appropriate education, and individualized education plans, or IEPs, or least restrictive plans, LREs. And so these are really important because it allows for a plan to be written and followed for that child throughout schooling. So an IEP, and many of you may be very familiar with this, an individualized education plan is a written statement, spells out a program that's specifically tailored for that student with a disability and what services that they're provided and what they need to have as they continue to develop. And these IEPs can, of course, be structured in a way that, as the child starts to develop and potentially need additional support services, that these can be amended as you go. Now, a least restrictive environment, this is a setting that's similar as possible to the one in which a child, in which children who do not have a disability are educated. And so we also want to talk about inclusion. And so this is educating a child with special education needs full-time in the regular classroom. And so inclusion is really important, not only for the child with a disability, but also for the children around them who do not have a disability, to be able to include that child into the environment. So we want an environment that this least restrictive environment, that's a setting that's as close to a neurotypical setting. Sometimes sometimes there are additional accommodations that need to be made, and that child can't be included into the classroom all day, but the attempt is to include them as much as possible and have it as inclusive as possible for that child. Many legal changes, and a lot of these legal changes regarding children with disabilities have been extremely positive, but of course there's going to be critics that argue that some children with disabilities may not benefit from inclusion in the regular classroom. The idea is just trying to do what's best for the child and being able to monitor that. So finally, we're going to end today with gifted adolescents. And so what I mean by gifted adolescents are those who have above average intelligence. So an average intelligence is about 100. That's what we call like average. And this, this is supposed to be kind of textbook average. But of course, this kind of moves. This is supposed to be the average, but it kind of moves to the right a little bit as we kind of change as humans. And so gifted adolescents are usually at an IQ of about a 130 or higher, or they might be very talented in a particular domain. So, for example, they might be very, very talented at art, music, or mathematics. They might have a typical IQ, but then that particular domain is something that they're very skilled in. And so programs for the gifted in most school systems, they select students who have intellectual superiority, academic aptitude, and they identify those children. So some of the characteristics that we find in children who are gifted, children and youth who are gifted are not maladjusted, okay? We find that they tend to march to their own drum. They tend to have a passion to master things. These are definite sort of characteristics that we tend to see. When we try to figure out what is the root, right? What is the cause? So a lot of times it's both nature and nurture. So there's usually some kind of like hereditary component, but also it's definitely the environment that the child is in, right? So how supportive that environment is. Individuals who are gifted, they tend to show signs of giftedness at a very young age prior to formal training and schooling, right? Those children tend to have families that are very supportive, very strong support, years of training and practice, and so these tend to be both kind of this sort of biological genetic kind of component where we see it very early on and it's likely to be a genetic thing, and then we also see that child is being highly encouraged by their family and supported. And we also find that not, the individuals who are highly gifted are typically not gifted in all domains, right? So if you have a child, for example, who is extremely gifted in music, they might not be as socially gifted. They might be either typical or even underperforming. So it's important to know that, just because you're good at one thing doesn't necessarily mean you're good at everything. Now, an increasing number of experts agree that the education of students who are gifted in the United States requires a significant overhaul. Like, this is not something that is being done probably as good as it should be. And we find that under-challenged students who are gifted, they tend to become disruptive, they skip class, they lose interest in achieving because they're not being challenged. A number of experts argue that too often students who are gifted are often socially isolated, and they are under challenged in the classroom. So that can be a major issue. So being socially isolated, pulling them out and saying, "Oh, you're special," but also not letting them kind of intermingle in with others, and under challenge. So these are the two probably biggest issues that we have in educating those who are gifted. And so one thing that's been argued is raising the standards for all children. And we've talked about this several times about just in general having a challenging environment is really important so that everybody is able to reach their highest potential. So if you have any questions about anything that we've covered today, please feel